Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, part of the public program series at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I'm Leslie McCall, Professor of Sociology and Political Science here at the Graduate Center, and also Associate Director of the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality, which is the co-host of tonight's discussion on building political alliances across race and class. This discussion continues a conversation begun in 2020, when we brought together leaders from inside and outside academia for a one-day virtual conference on the theme of coalitional democracy. And let me just give a quick plug for the conference videos and other materials, which are great resources and available at the Graduate Center and Stone Center websites. As we did then, tonight we will be talking a little less about division and polarization, the topic of most political commentary these days, and more about what can be achieved when a diverse majority joins together to solve problems that most of us care deeply about and even largely agree upon. This work is not easy, though. It's not as straightforward as coming up with a new slogan to win the next election and then starting all over again the following election. Instead, it's about years and even decades of grassroots organizing and political advocacy to create long-term fundamental changes in who benefits from economic prosperity and who makes political decisions for the common good. We're honored tonight to have guests who have been in various capacities centrally engaged in this kind of transformative work. I'll briefly introduce them, focusing on the work that relates to our theme tonight. So beginning with the panelists, Dana Kuhnline is currently the campaign manager of ReImagine Appalachia, a broad coalition working in the Ohio River Valley, which includes Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Over the past 2 decades, Dana has worked with dozens of groups on issues related to the environment, the economy, health, from improving water quality to helping to establish a new deal for Appalachians. Much of this work involves building coalitions among grassroots leaders to influence public policy at the federal level. Heather McGhee is visiting lecturer here at CUNY in the School of Labor and Urban Studies. Like Dana, Heather has 2 decades of experience working to bring about lasting change, most notably at Demos, where as president, she expanded and transformed that organization using a racial equity lens. She appears regularly in the media and is the author of the recent book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Us and How We Can Prosper Together, which was a New York Times bestseller and long listed for the National Book Award in nonfiction. Janelle Wong is professor of government, American and Asian American studies at the University of Maryland. She is co-principal investigator of the Multiracial Post-Election Survey and one of the country's leading experts on issues of race, immigration, religion, and political mobilization. She has worked closely with organizations that serve the Asian American population, including as co-director of AAPIdata.com. She is the author most recently of the book, Immigrants, Evangelicals, and Politics in the Era of Demographic Change. Lastly, tonight's moderator is Farah Stockman, a member of the New York Times editorial board, which she joined in 2020 after covering politics, social movements, and race for the paper's national desk. Previously, at the Boston Globe, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for her commentary on school desegregation in Boston. Her new book, just out late last year, is American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears. It is at once an intimate account of the lives of 3 steelworkers whose Indiana plant moved to Mexico in 2017, and at the same time, a profound reflection on the roots of our current political moment. A very, very warm welcome and thank you to our guests tonight, as well as to our listeners. Audience members will be able to ask questions towards the end of the hour using the Q&A function. I will turn it now over to Farah.
Thanks so much for having me. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight with these rock stars on this panel who are investigating what I consider to be one of the most important questions, not only for this country, but for the world. I write about foreign policy and all eyes are on American democracy right now. In countries like Iran, China, and Russia, they look at ethnic minorities as a weakness that your enemies can exploit. So those of us who really see diversity as a strength we have to get this right. And so that's why it's so great to be here with people who are working at the forefront of trying to find ways to forge multi-ethnic and coalitions across economic lines. I think I'm here today because a couple of years ago, I called up Leslie out of the blue and I was researching my book, and I was a little distressed because so much of our public discourse about race and class seems almost designed to prevent such coalitions from being built. Frequently, race and class are pitted against each other as if they're solitary silos that are engaged in some kind of existential duel. A lot of the newspaper accounts were asking, did white working class people vote for Trump because of economic anxiety or racial anxiety, as if the two things had nothing to do with each other. And I knew that they had something to do with each other. And sometimes they were very hard to disentangle because I had spent 4 years during the Trump administration following these steelworkers in a plant. I followed a Black man, a white man, and a white woman as the plant closed down around them and moved to a place where workers were going to do the job for much less. And at that plant, they had a bowling team, they had a union, they worked side by side. But when the bosses came and said, your job is going away, all hell broke loose. The white guy I followed was the union vice president, grandson of coal miners, super diehard union guy. And he went through the plant saying, don't train your Mexican replacement. Do not train them. If we don't train them, your job will not move away. Stand together with your union and we can save our jobs. Now, the Black guy I was following and the white woman I was following, they didn't feel the same way because they remembered when the white men in that plant hadn't wanted to train them. And so one of the most unapologetic trainers, volunteers to train the Mexican replacements was a Black man who remembered how poorly the union had treated his father and his uncles. So it was just the stark illustration of how our identities and our different histories can sometimes prevent us from speaking with one voice or joining together for a common cause. So how do we do better? We're here tonight to talk about that. And I'm gonna throw some questions to these great panelists, and then I'm gonna open it up for all of you. So get your questions ready for the chat. I just wanna tell a very brief snippet about a Black janitor at that plant who was hired in the early 60s. Like all the Black men at the plant were janitors, earning half of what the white machine operators made. And this Black janitor said to the union, don't you know that I can operate a machine? I've had technical training. I can operate a machine. And the union steward said to him, we know you can operate a machine. It's just that there's only so many jobs in this building. And if you get one of these jobs, then that's one less job for my son or for his nephew. It's one less job for the white men who'd been working in that plant all this time. And so I want to throw this question to Heather, because you've written so eloquently and so extensively on this zero-sum thinking and how it stops us from working together for the common good, for things that we all need. Mm-hmm. How do you overcome this zero-sum thinking when in people's daily lives on the workplace, they see it playing out?
Yeah. Thank you, Farah. First of all, I want to really thank, obviously, the Stone Center and CUNY and my colleagues here tonight for putting together this conversation. If you haven't read American Made, folks, you really should. It's a really, really beautiful book that I kind of wish had been out before I finished writing my book. So, you know, it's really complicated, and then at the same time it's really simple. So I came to the sort of body of research that speaks to this predominant way of seeing the world, this zero-sum racial lens that exists, that's predominant particularly among white Americans, much less so among people of color. And I think the anecdotes you share about, you know, the Black man being willing to train the Mexican worker because he, you know, didn't feel that he needed to jealously. I mean, obviously he wanted his job, but he also wasn't willing to. He was able to have a level of empathy about the Mexican workers who wanted their shot at the American dream. That zero sum is something that for me was a very helpful way to understand the limits of economics as a discipline to explain what's going on in the economy. Because it's actually quite counter to the way that we think about the sort of game model that we have for the economy, which would say that actually we want all of our players on the field scoring points for our team. Actually, inequality costs us in economic growth because we simply don't have enough people sort of maximizing their productivity and potential to start new businesses. And so we shouldn't be rooting against anybody on our team. But of course, the zero sum lie tells us that we're not all on the same team. So it really becomes a question of where you draw that circle of who's on your team, right? And ultimately, the project of being in a multiracial democracy, the project of having any kind of collective action for power and for problem solving is of drawing that circle wider than just your racial and ethnic group. And so it's no accident. You ask this sort of, tough question of like how when people are looking at limited spots, at the management table, people are looking at limited spots in schools, how are they not to take away this idea of the zero sum? But fundamentally, we are talking about a system that is set up to have less for everyone than there is for people at the very top. And so the context in which someone is jealously guarding, the last 3 middle-class jobs in a town, or where someone is jealously guarding that last spot in pre-K so that they can get to the good kindergarten, so is the context of not having great jobs and great schools in every neighborhood and every job being a great job. And so it's really that scarcity, right? A scarcity that is created by the people who have the power to set the rules, who are also often, of course, as we know, in politics, the ones who are selling the zero-sum idea for their own profit, the ones who want us to keep fighting with one another instead of fighting against them to change the rules to make life better for everybody.
Wobbling over crumbs at the end. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. I want to bring in Dana. You are working in Appalachia. You're trying to get coal miners and environmentalists on the same team. How do you change the thinking? I mean, there's a lot of people who would have thought those two groups would be zero sum, and a win for environmentalists is a loss for the working class coal miners. Can you tell us a happy story here?
No such thing. So first of all, my dad was a steel worker in a steel plant that shut down in the early 2000s. So I was reading your book and I was like, yep. So it was accurate.
They're making my day.
Yeah. So it is a good book. You should read it to the audience. So, but part of that is I'm an environmentalist whose family loves coal and the steel industry. So I am familiar with this on a personal level as well as a societal level. So I think, where do you start? It comes back to, the question of who's winning and why, and who's losing and what are they losing. And so one of the issues I work on with coal miners is actually black lung. And so it's incredibly difficult for miners with black lung to get their black lung benefits. And as the coal industry is collapsing, we've seen 55% of job loss in the coal industry in the last decade. So all these companies are going bankrupt, and then it's becoming even harder for them to get their benefits, and they're even more at risk. And we're seeing the same parallels happening in the environmental community of people who have these environmental impacts that have been left behind by the coal industry. And also these, that how is that going to get cleaned up? And so for me, that's really the same problem. It has the same root, which is that Appalachia has created tremendous amounts of wealth for the country, and none of it stayed there. So you end up with this false choice, or this, so it doesn't help me at all to put labor versus environment. I don't bite it at all because it's the same folks who are losing the game.
Is it a hard sell, or they come in the same room together and they can?
It's the work happens best when you pick an issue that's smaller, right? And so when you look at climate change, nobody likes flooding. Flooding is a huge issue in Appalachia. Nobody wants raw sewage in their basement. So no matter what percentage of things you agree with me on, we probably neither of us want to stand knee deep in raw sewage. And so we can talk about flooding, we can talk about community infrastructure, we can talk about the stuff we want to build in the future we want to build. And you can see the history, in the job loss. The story is there. Whether you, at this point, whether you love coal or not, it's done. And it's really sad and terrible what's happened to these communities. And so we have people that I've been working on this issue since 2004, 2005. And a decade ago, I've got some exciting stories, people who would like spit on me and push me around. They're like, can we do an op-ed together? Because this problem is huge. So you have counties that have lost all of their tax base. They're closing elementary schools. They're shutting down garbage service because the tax money that run the county came from the coal industry. You have the opioid crisis hitting the industry. So I think it's not everybody and it's not simple, but there's enough of the strings are unraveling around the edges that there's a lot of places to build from. And a lot of it is like, we both see this problem. What are some solutions? Does that help?
Yeah, great. I want to bring in Janelle. Okay, so you've specialized on immigration and immigrant communities, which, pose some special challenges to coalition building. Can you talk a little bit about any successes you've seen in that area?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to Leslie McCall for organizing and to the Stone Center for hosting this event. And it's really an honor to be here with these distinguished, as you say, superstar, rock star panelists, including yourself. I'd like to start with a historical example. In the late 1880s, Frederick Douglass, Black abolitionist and a great American public thinker, was one of the few and perhaps one of the most prominent figures to speak out against the exclusion of Chinese people via restrictive immigration laws. And this really foreshadowed the current moment. So I recently published a paper with Nyambi Carter and an undergrad, Lisette Guerrero, titled Reconsidering Group Interests, Why Black Americans Are More Progressive on Immigration Policy Than Asian Americans. And we find that while Asian Americans are, like most Americans, fairly progressive on immigration policy, that Black people are even more so. Including, and I know this dovetails with some of your work, including on legal immigration. And so this is true, even though Asian Americans are a majority immigrant population and only about 10% of Black people are immigrants, even though Black people express higher levels of economic competition than Asian Americans do with immigrants. And even though Asian Americans are the primary direct beneficiaries of both family-based and employment-based visas. So Black people are more supportive of increasing those who come in via both these categories than Asian Americans, both family-based and employment-based legal visas. And they are also more supportive than Asian Americans when it comes to agreeing with a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. So this strong support among Black people for immigration and immigrant rights, it maintains even among those who are low income, even among those who express fears of economic competition from immigrants. And these patterns, I think, demonstrate such an important model for solidarity, because a coalition in this case is built on doing what is right and what is just, not only because it directly obviously benefits one's group, but because one sees the long-term benefits in doing the right thing and moving beyond the zero-sum mindset that Heather writes so eloquently about.
It's fascinating. I have so many follow-ups, but I want to get to my next round and also to questions from the audience as well. Going back to you, Heather, you talk about the solidarity dividend and what we can what we can gain when we get over our zero-sum thinking. Can you tell us a story that illustrates this, so that readers or people watching who may not have read your book can sort of see what you're talking about? And
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm still reeling from Janelle's like bombshell disclosure of this data that I did not know about. I'm so thrilled. I knew about Frederick Douglass during the Chinese Exclusion Act, but I did not know about this contemporary data. That's fascinating. I can't wait to read it. I want to tell a story that's actually not in the book. So the book came out last year. And for the past 6 months or so, it kept getting pushed back because of the COVID travel restrictions. I have been back on the road again. The Sum of Us is really the story of a journey across the country, and I've been doing more cross-country travel and driving and trains and back to more places, really just focused on this concept of the solidarity dividend, which is sort of the other big concept in my book, other than the zero-sum racial hierarchy and the drained pool politics of racial resentment driving down support for public goods among white people. The solidarity dividend is really defined as the gains that we can unlock through cross-racial coalition building. Just understanding that collective action has power, and in a multiracial country and communities, we need that collective action to be cross-racial. So I've been all around finding new stories of the solidarity dividend, because it does feel like that's what we need to hear, and that's why I'm so glad about this conversation tonight. We need to see what it takes to create these alliances. And I think it's going to be the first episode. It comes out in late July. The series does. The first episode takes me to Memphis, and in Memphis, it's one of the most segregated cities in the country. You can say that about a lot of cities, but Memphis is one of the most segregated cities in the country. Of course, it's the city where we lost Dr. King. There are neighborhoods that are 100% black and 100% white. It is as stark as it comes. And the black neighborhoods in Southwest Memphis are really disinvested. You drive around them, you can go for miles in Nazi restaurants. There are not many lights on at night. And there was an oil pipeline that was being slated to go through Memphis. And which neighborhoods did they decide to place the oil pipeline through? Right? Of course, Southwest Memphis and the historically and contemporarily black neighborhoods. However, this phenomenon of a powerful, polluter choosing what they literally accidentally one day on tape called the path of least resistance through the black neighborhoods, that was a mistake, obviously, to actually have it on record. This normally happens all the time, and the black community doesn't have enough political power to stop it, right? But in this instance, there was another threat, not just to the black land ownership in Southwest Memphis, to women like Scotty Fitzgerald, who still had the yellowed bill of sale of her parents having bought that land back when it was nearly impossible for black people to own land. But also this huge aquifer that sits under the city of Memphis that gives Memphis some of the best and cleanest water and cheapest, most affordable water in the country. And so the white environmentalists in the Tony parts of town were up in arms about the fact that this oil pipeline was going to go right over this aquifer as well, and that it would threaten the whole city's water. And so in the wake of the racial uprising summers of 2020, at the time, I think 4-year-old preacher's son, a black man named Justin Pearson, became a sudden organizer, creating a cross-racial alliance called Memphis Community Against the Pipeline that brought the, Sierra Clubs and the Protect Our Aquifer white environmentalists into deep relationship with the Scotty Fitzgeralds of the world, the mostly elderly black women who were getting notes on the door saying that we are going to take part of your land through eminent domain to make this pipeline. And they were able to win and stop a pipeline. And you don't stop pipelines that often in this country. And it really was explicitly a cross-racial coalition led by the most impacted people. And I will say that throughout the research that I'm doing and the recording and reporting that I'm doing for this podcast, you know, the summer of 2020, George Floyd's murder, all of that is a big part of the story of where something cracked open and the possibility of more cross-racial organizing happened. And I think we can't, there's a lot of, I think, cynicism about, where did all the people in the streets go? Where did all the BLM signs go? But I am really discovering that it's sort of settled into the fibers of communities in ways that can't be undone. And things are happening now that would not have happened in 2019 or in 2018. Like the stopping of a pipeline, like a cross-racial coalition in one of the most segregated cities in the country.
Thank you for that story. That's an amazing story. And it makes me wonder whether the language that we developed during George Floyd helped those, help those coalitions move forward. But I have a couple more questions and then I'm going to open it up. I am wondering, Dana, the eyes of the whole country were on West Virginia this year because of Joe Manchin. People suddenly became experts in West Virginia the moment he hit the front page. Tell us, what are we getting wrong? Those of us who are sitting in the cities, those of us who are college educated, those of us who are, used to making or being in proximity to people who are making all the decisions. What do we get wrong when we look at West Virginia and talk about what needs to happen there with Joe Manchin or anybody else?
Is Joe Manchin? If I had $1 for every time I talked about Joe Manchin, and I've been working with him since he was governor, so I'm very familiar with him. I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, first, a lot changed in the state. So West Virginia has 1.8 million people, which is less than the Cincinnati metro area, or name your metro area. It's a small state. People know each other. And so what's interesting about organizing in a smaller state is that you can't help but be cross issue, because there's just not enough people to silo yourself. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But definitely you do see a lot of cross work. And one of the things that it's made me realize is when we think about climate change activism, that we really need to be thinking about community development and community investment, because everything that comes with mitigating climate change is actually going to improve communities, especially if we do it right and we do it with a plan that puts people who are most at risk first. So I think you really see that in West Virginia when you see folks planning and how they think about the issue and how they frame the issue. It really is about community investment and community development, what we want to build next. There's also a lot of just out-of-state folks dumping things into the state. We've always had that literally with taking other people's garbage, and now we have it metaphorically. A couple things, a couple takeaways. One, as a person who has a long time history in working on extractive issues, the way that outside organizations, I think, view low income and marginalized communities feels extractive, especially in political campaigns. And it's not just West Virginia. I feel like you see it in Black communities in Georgia, et cetera. They come in, they wear people out, they tire folks, they do things in a boom and bust way. And then they disappear when it's boring to them, whereas everybody else is there for the long term. And local organizing in rural communities and in marginalized communities, it's runs on personal relationships. People are putting their local reputation, their family safety on the line when they organize in these rural communities. And so when you just disappear, things don't happen in a couple weeks. They happen over a very long period of time. So West Virginia was historically a blue state. Over the last decades, it's become a very red state. And that is not going to change in a couple weeks. And it's not going to change with a billboard, no matter how awesome the billboard is, though most of them were terrible. So one of the things we're really looking at now in the state, like right now, I do coalition building, I do facilitation work, and there's a lot of groups that are coming to me like, we're planning a listening project. We want to do really deep, long-term thinking about what we want to build and where we want to be and how we're going to get there. And knowing that it's building beyond the next election or the next campaign or the next short-term thing. And I think we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do the short-term stuff, but we have to always be thinking about that, the marathon. So gosh, I mean, I could say so much. Maybe the last thing I'll say is, for the price of a commercial, you can hire an organizer for like a year. And I would rather have 1 year of on the ground, boots on the ground work than whatever 5 or 10 minutes of how many times this commercial is going to air, especially if it's probably made by a tone deaf person who's never met a working class person anyway. So that's all.
Well, the tone deafness, we could talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, so Janelle, I want to get to you because you wrote a book about evangelicals and immigrants. And I've heard you say that one of the most multi-ethnic groups in America is actually the evangelical church. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and whether conservatives are actually managing to build these multi-ethnic coalitions in a way that we don't usually acknowledge.
Yeah, thank you so much, Farah. I mean, I think we have to start with the fact that Trump kicked off his campaign in Florida in 2019 at a Latino evangelical church, and it was not until October of 2020 that Biden made a major campaign stop at a Latino evangelical church. So Trump ran on an anti-immigrant platform, appealed to white racial antagonisms, and yet, as you point out, and others have observed, exit polls showed a slight uptick in support among Black, Latino, and Asian American voters between 2016 and 2020, not a majority of any of these groups. So there was a critical mass of voters of color that supported Trump, and he didn't seem to lose support over his presidency. My analysis of the 2020 multiracial post-election survey led by Lori Frazier at UCLA sheds some insight, and it's not pretty. So let me step back. For whites, lower levels of education, not lower levels of income, were a driver of support for Trump. For Latinos, low income actually, so this gets to the working class kind of appeal, was not a major correlate after controlling for party identification, but religion was. And for Black and Asian voters, lower levels of education are associated with both voting for Trump and identifying as Republican. But the striking finding I want to share here is that anti-Black attitudes, including internalized stereotypes among Black voters, are a consistent and powerful driver of conservatism across all racial groups. And I also find that anti-Black stereotypes are more critical for understanding people of color's opposition to policies like affirmative action, powering opposition even more than in-group favoritism. So what does this mean? It means that focusing on economics is important, but it only gets us so far. And I'll just go here. This is why I find the position some Asian Americans have taken in terms of increasing access for Black and Latino students to magnet schools in New York City and these policies at Harvard so dismaying. It is a very short-sighted logic to hoard resources for one's own group and then defend a status quo that locks out people via racist status quo admissions policies. And research actually shows that anti-Black racism is a major predictor of these kinds of opposition to these kinds of policies. I'll end here that luckily my research shows that those who oppose programs like affirmative action are in the minority in Asian America. This has been true since 2008 when we first started collecting data. So there's still a potential for solidarity. And over the past 5 years, I've worked in coalition with other Asian Americans to challenge the assumption that defending or instituting policies to increase access to education for Black and Latinx people is anti-Asian.
There's a lot there to unpack. I guess what I'm curious whether you can tell us how much of this is messaging. right? In order to talk about some of this stuff, we talk about white privilege, anti-Blackness. These are phrases that come out of graduate schools. They're phrases that come from, highly educated places. And yet when we're trying to talk to working class people, they may not be familiar with it. They may, in my own experience, when I was talking to these steel workers, right, this twice laid off white steel worker was in no mood to be lectured by a Harvard educated New York Times person about his privilege, right? That was not going to happen. And so I guess I'm just, I don't know, I kind of want to throw it out there. How do we break through? Because he's the one who needs to understand it, right? Like you talking about the union, when I talk about white privilege, you could see his the hair stand up on the back of his neck. But when I started talking about the union and saying, Wally's dad or Wally's uncle, the union wouldn't even train him on his machine. He had to learn from afar. He had to learn by watching from afar because no one would train him. You take it for granted that someone's going to train you, that your union brother's going to come train you. And so, like, when I started talking about that, he started getting it. It started clicking, but it wasn't the language of white privilege that was going to get him there. It was labor organizing and this notion of solidarity. We have this huge reservoir in the labor movement that is about cross-racial organizing in the labor movement, but we rarely hear those stories. We hear a lot of stories about the opposite, about the unions, keeping people out. But do we need a few hopeful stories from the past about the unions standing in solidarity? I guess I just want to throw that out. Does anybody want to, sort of a surprise question there, but does anyone want to take that?
I see Heather has unlocked.
So first of all, yeah, I personally don't love the phrase white privilege as a persuasion tool, right? It is accurate. It is not complete, right? Because I do think that ultimately in a society where there has been a racial bargain to divide people by race and to ask white people to choose their color instead of their class, it is, as I said before, like a privilege in a system where not enough people have enough privileges and enough dignities and enough respect. But I don't think you, as you got to, Farah, I don't think that you need to tell somebody, anybody about racism, actually, because they all actually have examples from their lives and they know the system is rigged and they wouldn't trade, and nobody who's not Black would trade their life for being to be a Black person. And like, it's a little bit of like a weird thing, gaslighting thing, that we act like, we need to like teach these concepts when like this is just academics trying to talk to each other in erudite ways about the real world, right? Like, and now we're trying to translate it back to the real world. It doesn't make much sense. But to your last question, I do think, fundamentally, right, you start with common values, you name an enemy, you make sure it's not each other, right? And then you have to give an example from the past of or from a neighboring town, whatever it is, of when this has worked before, right? You just have to, because otherwise there's so much cynicism, particularly among working class people and poor people and people of color. And so, I think about the example that I give in the book of Stand Up Kansas City, which is this, it ultimately became a Fight for 15 organization, but a fast food organizing group in Kansas City, again, one of the most segregated cities in the country, where they really very explicitly, decorated their organizing room with, icons of labor history and civil rights history. And they really took their lessons from the meat packers, right? And the meat packers were a union that in the Midwest was one of the CIO unions who really was explicit about needing to have integrated shop and interracial organizing and have Black and white teams at all times, and just recognizing the truth that actually was the truth that the first major labor union in the country, the Knights of Labor, knew, which is that you can't have anybody outside the union. They will be used as a tool to grind down your wages, right? Why would we exclude anybody? And that was, it's common sense, right? It's collective action and labor organizing is about power and numbers. So why wouldn't you want every single person in the union and not outside of the union? But I think it is important to tell those stories, tell the stories of a woman, Bridget Hughes, a white fast food worker who totally grew up in a conservative environment, but ultimately decided that it's not about us versus them, because for us to come up, they've got to come up too. And as long as we're divided, we're conquered. And racism is bad for white workers too, because it keeps us divided from our black and brown brothers and sisters. Those are all direct quotes from Bridget. So that's a really important piece of it, is the explicit consciousness raising and appeal to solidarity. But it can't you can't take it for granted. You can't ignore the fact that we need to see more of it, right? Like, just very quickly, like the way that in Georgia, we so often see those two senators together, right? A young Jewish man and a black man. Like, there's a reason why they do that. You don't always see Kristen Gillibrand and Chuck Schumer together, right? They are doing that to show Georgia that, like, it's possible to see this black man and white man together fighting on behalf of the people of Georgia. And even just that visual is helpful for us to understand that it's possible.
Dana, I wanted to go to you just because West Virginia has this incredible history that I learned when I was reporting on my book of seceding from Virginia during the Civil War because they didn't want to, well, there's complications there, but those
basically
rich bastards in
Yes.
Richmond, they weren't going to fight for them. Those slave owners, you know, the people of Appalachia were poor in general. But tell us about a little bit. There's a powerful story from West Virginia about coal miners and race. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we don't hear those stories. We hear stereotypes of white working class people that that tend to make us not want to partner with them. So
yeah, so I think, first of all, there are Black Appalachians and there are Black rural people, and just not invisibilizing huge swaths of the population is helpful, and just like not naming that they exist and that they have a history in the community, that the Highlander Center where Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks trained was started in part by Black Appalachians. So there is really a lot of power in that community and a lot of resiliency. But yeah, as far back as the 1920s, union organizers for coal miners knew that the coal company would try to divide people by race. When folks would come into the coal camps, they would separate them out by language and by race, and then they would put them on shifts together with folks who didn't speak the same language so that they couldn't talk to each other and that they couldn't organize. So one of the quotes is that everyone's the same color underground in the dark. Obviously, it's never that simple, you know, but there was that core value that the only way to win was to band together against the company. And so you do have in 1921, you had all these miners who came back from World War I and they had guns and they knew how to fight. And so the situations were so bad in the coal camps that they rose up against the coal industry. It was the largest armed insurrection aside from the Civil War. It was the only time that the US government dropped bombs on its own people. And they ended up giving up after 5 days of battle. There were, I don't remember, 7,000 people. I have it written down somewhere, because they had just come back from the war and they weren't willing to raise their weapons against fellow soldiers who were wearing the uniforms they had just been wearing. And some of them were wearing their World War I, you know, helmets and uniforms that they had come home from the war in, and were fighting against the coal industry. So there's definitely that strong history of labor history. And then coming back up to the more close future, you know, a couple of years ago, there were all the teacher strikes, and those actually began in West Virginia. There was an incredible work organizing in the state around the teacher strikes. Bus drivers, everybody was coming in on it together. And the history of Blair Mountain was very rich and very much a part of the fabric of that, because it was an inspiration, like, we can do this again. So there is a really strong labor history in the state, and it has always been a part of it, has been about, you know, interracial, inter-community, cultural. bridging those careers.
I think there's a movie coming out about Blair Mountain, actually.
I can keep track.
But yeah, I think
You should go to May 1. It's exciting.
these are stories that can, I don't know, stories inspire us and tell us a bit more. And I have to be honest, I knew very little about labor history when I started researching this book. And it surprised me because, again, when you hear people say, well, nobody gave me this privilege to have this job. A job with dignity. I fought for that job. That's what these white steelworkers would say. My grandparents fought, for a living wage, and they fought for a day off, and they fought for all those things. No, the white boss man didn't just give it to us. And that's like something that often gets, is missing from our memory. I wanted to open it up to a few questions here. One of the questions is about why when we talk about organizing across coalition, across racial lines, why don't we talk about people of color organizing with each other? Why is it always about whites organizing with people of color? Maybe Janelle, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's this is really a product of thinking about the two terms that you told us to stay away from, which are white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Those are such powerful forces in society. It's really hard, I think, not to consider that when we are talking about organizing. But I also think that there are these examples of multiracial coalitions that have moved forward. I do think Georgia is a great example of that, where we saw Stacey Abrams really drawing on long-term, deep relationships among people of color way back in time, not just starting in 2018, right? And so I think there is a way to do that. I'm part of two different amicus teams that are multiracial, Asian American, Black, and Latinx, that are really trying to preserve, for instance, affirmative action. Or at the local level, we are fighting to increase access to specialized magnet programs, right? This is the difference between the opposition, which tends to be predominantly one group, either white or Asian, and this multiracial coalition, I think, is really stark and really powerful for people to just see. We are represented, our group is represented, our legal counsel is Asian Americans Advancing Justice, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Latino Justice. And so that organizing is happening, and it can be both symbolically powerful and substantively important.
There's a question for Dana about Joe Manchin. What are the chances that West Virginia could get something better? Is there a future for a better choice? And there's another related question about whether organizers should focus on trying to persuade him versus trying to replace him.
Sure. I mean, it's because the second question goes back to what I said earlier, is that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, or run a marathon while chewing gum, so I think we have to do both. I think I would start and say Joe Manchin is smart. You might not like him, and he doesn't care if you like him, but he is the only federally elected Democrat in the state for a reason. And it's because he knows what he's doing. Like I said, West Virginia was a historically blue state that honestly saw a lot of terrible changes under Democratic leadership. And so folks aren't dumb. They have very good reasons for not trusting the Democratic establishment as it is. And so one of the things that folks are trying to do in a long-term way is to rebuild that. And you have to create good changes. I I have an organization that I worked with, and they sent out this Christmas fundraising pitch. It was like, we were working with this family, and parents died during the opioid crisis. So they were in foster care, and then their foster parents died during COVID. So now they're homeless again. So like, this is what folks are dealing with when you're saying, and now text your senator. That's the life that they're finding dignity in, and the choices that they're making. And so there are a lot of very real on the ground dynamics that folks are dealing with. All that being said, there's also a lot of very powerful, brilliant people doing work in the state. So I think it's about both. But the other thing I'll say, and one thing Joe Manchin said, is that if you want more progressive policies, you have to elect more progressive people. And that is not, I don't want to dump everything on West Virginia. And I know people love to dump things on West Virginia and Appalachians. So it's such a nice habit. It's such an easy habit to get into. But like, look at the middle class, look at the suburbs, all those places are electing Republicans too. And lots of other states are electing Republicans that put Joe Manchin in the place of being that 50th Democratic senator who's trying to hold on by tooth and nail in a state that has a lot of reasons to historically distrust the Democratic Party. So there are a lot of dynamics on there. And so I'm happy to have the focus on Appalachia, but I also think we need to not lay all our burdens on folks who are already carrying a lot.
Yeah. Well, I always wonder if people would rather have a Republican in there, which is what the alternative might be. But I guess I want to know from the three of you whether you think we listen enough to the working class, because there's this sense of, okay, you guys don't know your own interests, you don't vote your own interests, and there's a patronizing. The idea that we know their interests is a little bit, I have to question that a little bit. And so I guess I'm just wondering if you think listening is a part of it, because we all know that the Democratic Party used to be the party of blue-collar people, and the less educated you were, the more likely you were to be a Democrat. And now that's flipped. Now it's the highly educated class, or the highly educated, the more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. So I don't want to turn this political, but just I'd love to hear whether you think we could do a better job listening. I don't know. Anybody want to take that?
Sure. I mean, like, each of us has different positions in this. You on the editorial board, organizer in West Virginia, academic, advocate, like we have different sort of positions and roles to play in that question. But I think fundamentally, everything that anybody believe comes from a story they've been told. And so what I don't want to give, I really don't like the idea, although people sort of read that from, the argument I'm making in my book, that, I really don't like the idea of saying that people are voting against their own interest, or white people are voting against their own interest, because I think they're just defining their interest in a way that is perfectly willing to sacrifice a material interest, for a psychological wage of whiteness, as Du Bois would say, right? And they're also, rightly sort of trusting in their gut that ultimately having white people in power is, going to probably be better for white people. And so I think that's not wrong. But I also think that all of those ideas, all of those experiences, all of those beliefs also come from stories that powerful people have told them, and from learning lessons that are expressed in societal structures that powerful people have created and reified. And so I just, I think I don't think that we, come naturally to our ideas and our cultural essences, right? I think we are all being formed by powerful storytellers and by the rules of the game in which we operate. And so it's sort of no less what frustrates me is when I see people with a lot of privilege and education forgetting that there are people with privilege and education sort of also shaping what we are supposed to be listening to. That's sort of like just like a deep cultural part of another culture that we feel like we're not a part of, and just recognizing that we're all living in our structures and all that we believe comes from stories we've been told and the interests that have been lined up for us.
Thank you. Janelle, there's a question for you about asking you to again share the name of the article you referenced showing public opinion data on different support for documented and undocumented. And there's someone who says, when we're looking at conservatives that are able to build multiracial, multi-class alliance, doesn't that count? Doesn't that count? Are we counting them as something that is worth building and joining? So I don't know.
Wow, that's an interesting question. The paper is called Redefining Group Interests, and it's in the Du Bois Review. Why do Black people demonstrate more progressive attitudes towards immigration than Asian Americans? But on the question of, does solidarity towards conservative causes count as solidarity? I mean, yeah, it does count as a kind of solidarity. Towards what end? I think this is where we start to have to think about shared goals, and it is there. It is powerful. Yes, we do see it. It is doing the work of defining some of the narratives that Heather's talking about, right? It's conservative movements across difference do matter. I'm not discounting it. From my perspective, is there also solid, can we build solidarity towards my vision of justice? I think we've been moving in the discussion in that way. So yes, I don't discount it. It's we can maybe learn from some of those solidarities. It's about having that powerful narrative, I think.
Someone says, how do we put the class back in the race, class, gender on college campuses? And another person asks, where could I find information on West Virginia's negative experience with the Democratic Party? We have 1 more minute. I promised all of you and our audience that we would get out on time, but maybe you all could just, those were the 2 questions, sort of how do we put the class back in race, class, gender? And like, let's just end on you. Do you each want to give 1 sentence to end on sort of where we're going, I guess, or
so I'll just say too, the history of the Democratic Party in West Virginia, they had power for 80 years. So everything that happened in West Virginia for the last 80 years is what happened under the Democratic Party. So you can just look at that. Simple enough. And then I'm not in academia anymore. Not sad about that. But I will say, as a first generation college student, as a working class kid, it sucked. That's as a white girl who can mostly pass, but like, there's a lot, it's not great. So I would love to see more class analysis happening in universities. And I see it so much impacting the way I'm able to do my work as a campaigner, because people just assume that bad things are happening in your communities because you're dumb, because you're poor. And they were like, have you tried telling the news? And I'm like, yes, like we actually did think of that. It's incredibly how much the bias impacts us. And yeah, so class matters. I hand it off.
Who wants to go next? Heather, do you?
I do think that we are seeing like exactly what the Powell memo and the long-term strategy to ensure minority rule is bringing to the country, whether it's the Alito leak decision, voting rights, affirmative action, all of these things, the unprecedented concentrations of wealth and power, and the information disorder that's going on with billionaires controlling our public squares. And so the only thing to do from that space is organize, organize, organize. And the only way to get it done is to do it cross-racially. And that's just the truth that every state is learning in one way or another, and just needs to come faster and faster.
And I'll just say that scholars of race and gender were the first to also kind of think through how race, gender, and class worked in tandem with one another.
Well, I want to thank you three for bringing us inspiring stories that give us hope that tomorrow is going to be better than today. So I really appreciate everyone who's joined this discussion tonight. And I hope we can all sort of start taking these lessons into our lives to figure out how we can continue to build the country that we want and need and deserve. So thank you all. Thank you, Leslie, for having us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.